One of the reasons that Mishima is still alive in so many's imagination is that he left so many legacies. The way he held himself, the way he dressed, the way he thought. He was a dandy. He knew that one of the great and best-kept secrets of being alive is if you behave the way you want to be, you will become it. You become who you are by practicing it. And little by little, you will turn into who you want to be. This is what he taught people, and when we're the kind of person who knows this and is doing it, the appeal is absolutely extraordinary.
I think that Mishima was an excruciatingly self-conscious human being, and that he had a kind of vision of himself which is much more particular and careful and schematic, and to that extent artificial, possibly, than mortal human beings like us. And so I think he really did see himself as, first of all, an artist, and then as things began to develop in him, he began to see himself in other ways as well. Ultimately, his life was part of his art.
Mishima didn't come out of no place. He belongs to a kind of tradition. A tradition that the West has, too, of the extremely talented young person who comes out, who grows up, and we watch the growth.
He was a great prodigy. When he was 12, he was turning out very beautifully finished stories. When he was 16, he wrote a tour de force of 120 pages, which completely wowed the far right-wing romantic school of adult writers at the Peers School, where he was a student, because he had written it in 11th century court Japanese flawlessly at the age of 16. So this was a word master to begin with, who really could function in an absolutely astonishing way. He really did see himself as an heir to the tradition of what I'll call Japanese elegance. Mishima had decided very early on that he was going to, with his pen, give the reader a world of Japanese beauty and elegance that no one else actually had access to. And to some extent, I believe that that was something he achieved during his long and prolific career. Mishima's teacher, mentor, champion was, in fact, Kawabata Yasunari. If you read a poetic novel like Snow Country and so on, you see this kind of laconic, understated attempt to limn something that Kawabata would have asserted was quintessentially Japanese beauty. One place it certainly comes from is the tale of Genji. And both Kawabata and Mishima had spent many long years reading and rereading the tale of Genji. Genji is this complex, deeply delineated story which is subtle always from beginning to end. There's nothing, Tanizaki said, let literature live in the shadowed eaves, not out in the porcelain brightness of Western obvious creation. So if you think of literature as as something that occurs in the darkness or in the semi-darkness, where, according to Tanizaki, Japanese beauty really thrives like a mushroom without too much light, then you can see that the Genji, which is this gorgeous web, really, of deeply shadowed, deeply nuanced storytelling, is something that would appeal to people like this, who are in touch with their own traditional roots.
Of course, the influence is not only Japanese and not only the Japanese genre that he is in. A great influence from the West informs him, as of course it does all Japanese artists. The man that Mishima often talked most about was Gabriel D'Annunzio, who is a great extravagant man, somewhat like Mishima himself. He expressed himself emotionally, sexually, in a way which Mishima apparently found attractive. And at the same time, he was a man of politics. You remember at the end of World War, he wasn't doing very good, so he went up to Salo, which is the name that Pasolini used in his infamous film, which in a way is about D'Annunzio. And up there had his own little kingdom, had his own little army, had something very much like Mishima himself contrived when he made the Tatenokai army, that he was going to defend Japan with. But if you look at his life and you look at the way he behaved and you look at his wardrobe and you look at everything else, another name indubitably comes up, and that is Lord Byron. He was a man who didn't care anything about convention. He felt he could do what he wanted to do. He went to romantic places. He was highly political in that he joined the Greek forces in order to free Greece and actually died in Greece. This is a little bit like Mishima. How did these writers think of power then? They thought of aesthetic power, artistic power, as being almost equal to political power. And they both continually wrote about their subject, which is how ideas can move people and create things. However, you can also define yourself negatively. And one of the people that Mishima always said he disliked very, very much and would never want to be like was Ernest Hemingway. He didn't like the celebration of age, which is one of the things that Hemingway embarked upon later in his career. This all came to an abrupt stop one evening when he asked me out for dinner, and what he wanted to talk about that evening, my purpose was informational, was to find out why had Hemingway done this. Why had Hemingway stuck his shotgun into his mouth and pulled the trigger? Why had this man who'd been following this macho ideal, why did he do it that way? Now, this is about, a year or so before he himself killed himself. But since we know that he was thinking about it, he wanted to find out more about suicide. And he wanted to find out, why a person who was like himself in so many ways had done this. He was scandalized by it, which is very touching because he himself was going to do much the same thing in just a year. Of course, Mishima also is his works. After the Confessions of a Mask came Sound of Waves. After that came the novel many think to be his best, which is The Temple of the Gold Pavilion. After that came After the Banquet, and the books can be seen as a vindication for himself. He had a rather unhappy childhood, and he was concerned with vindicating himself all throughout his life.
All of our evidence about what went on in young Mishima's mind comes from Confessions of a Mask, which is quite autobiographical. The impact on Mishima the artist of Mishima the young boy's experience at the hands of his crazy and ailing grandma. It's one of those things that's very, very difficult to get at. If we believe him, the effect of all this was to create in a very young person already an almost bottomless and dark kind of notion about beauty and death and eros and all these other things that were to be lifelong themes of Mishima's. He talks about masturbating to the St. Sebastian picture when he's 6, of his horror at discovering that this beautiful soldier is Joan of Arc. Some of this stuff is so gorgeous that we, of course, think, wait a minute, can that have been? Who knows if it can have been? Certainly it was a ghastly way to start out life.
As a little boy, he became extremely unsure of this whole thing called life, I would dare say. And then when it came time for him to serve his country, he was found to be sickly, and so he wasn't drafted along with all of his friends at Pierce School where he was going. The Japanese were inculcated to believe that they must support their country and their emperor. If you're going to be taken prisoner, then you must kill yourself. So the idea of killing yourself is quite endemic in the wartime ethic, and it's no surprise that Mishima was infected, if that's the word, by it. He grew up with the idea that he was sort of unworthy on several levels, and one of them was that all of his friends got killed and he didn't.
And the fact that he, in fact, managed to convert the pain, the conflict, the disorientation of that experience into a writer's art is one of the great mysteries of this man, I suppose, and of art in general.
Once he has perfected autobiography, then he's ready to go into the outside world, which he began to do with the Temple of the Gold Pavilion, where he took an alter ego from the unfortunate acolyte who actually did burn down the Golden Pavilion, and told the story from his point of view.
Temple of the Golden Pavilion is perhaps the earliest complete metaphorical description of Mishima's relationship to what he defines as beauty. And the temple represents beauty, and the very presence of the temple imposes itself on the imagination of the protagonist in a way that binds him and renders him basically impotent in every sense of that word. The protagonist of that novel, writes early in the book that he had been hoping and praying that the temple would be destroyed during the war and during the fire bombings that took place in 1944, 1945, because he can't live, he can't survive in the presence of something as beautiful as this. And then he writes, 1945 came and went and I was still alive. And I didn't know what to do, and this terrible gap opened between me and the beauty to which I somehow at once aspired and wanted to get away from. This is all about Mishima's version of elegance, beauty, death, destruction as both the principal goal and aspiration of a special person's life, an artist's life, as well as the principal challenge, impediment to happiness in his life.
When he wrote down the Confessions of a Mask, he wasn't really concerned with redoing himself. This came later, much later. It started through his boxing lessons. He decided to take up boxing, which is an emasculatizing process, and so he changed everything diametrically. The 90-pound weakling became this great strapping, weightlifting, muscle-bound person. The very shy boy that stuttered became this great glittering celebrity that could command thousands and keep everybody breathless at what he did. All of these things were not him. He made them himself. And so I think it follows, therefore, that he wanted to control his environment to the extent that he did.
I've never known anyone, personally certainly, who had so many different aspects of himself which he kept so discreetly apart, one from the other. He had his literary friends, obviously, because he was a major literary figure. He had his bodybuilding friends, and he used to bring his bodybuilding friends home, and they would sort of oil up and do photographing and so on at home. He had his theater friends. Subsequently, late in his life, he had his young boy in his thrall army friends. So on and on and on. And when he died, of course, everyone said, "Oh, I knew him really well. Oh, God, I guess I didn't know him at all." That was sort of a reaction that almost everybody who was honest had.
Those of us who knew Mishima rather well ended up realizing that we were on the casting couch, as it were, that he cast everybody in his life in the drama of his life. He was a master director. There was a stairway in his house that didn't really go anyplace. It went up to a little door near the ceiling, and it was used entirely for his descent. He would descend down these stairs into the party below, and the descent of Mishima, Deus Ex Machina, down those steps was one of the high points of the party. He was not ever content with his position. He was always doing other things. I think that's the reason why he was doing things which were non-literary and which scandalized the establishment, like singing pop songs on the stage, taking up sports like kendo. All of these things were attempts to express himself further than the confines of the chosen vehicles.
If you think of a painting being done, basically Misha is filling that canvas in, it seems to me, in a fairly consistent way. In Kyoko's house, there's a lot more detail going onto that canvas. So he's adding details, in fact, to this lethal fantasy that he's creating both as a literary man and as an individual attempting to survive. Kyoko's house is a composite built of 4 separate characters. And the central character is the narcissist actor. All these characters are hindered by something which Mishima himself felt, an inability to feel truly and vibrantly alive. And each of them takes a different approach to feeling vitality and aliveness, all of which Mishima was aware of and played around with in his own way. The boxer goes into action which leads him into right-wing, maybe terrorist behavior. And the actor in particular discovers pain and realizes that he is in fact a masochist, and that by feeling pain and somehow playing with death, he can approach a state of feeling vitally alive. So the importance of Kyoko's house is that it is a kind of blueprint, really, for the kinds of experience and the kinds of conclusions about his experience that Mishima was to draw increasingly consciously into the 60s, leading up to the 1970 incident.
One of the things that Mishima used to do is he'd send presages out to his friends and acquaintances. After he died, a close friend of his named Yoshi Oida, the actor, and I tried talking about this, and Oida said he'd received intimations from Mishima full 5 years before the event that the event was going to occur. So Mishima knew the script very well while he was living it, and he was letting us know, too, what it was. He had the various stations along the way to the final scene, one of which, of course, is the movie Patriotism.
Patriotism, inspired by the assassination of the then head of the Japanese Socialist Party, Asanuma Inejiro. Mishima had created the story of a young warrior, member of the Imperial Guard, who decides to kill himself and his wife after a night of gorgeous, erotic sexual connection. And this is the first time, actually, when Mishima sees that terrorism can actually offer the possibility of a battlefield in a time when there isn't actually a war going on. You create your battlefield. And so that theme, I think, is echoed and developed fulsomely in the second volume of the tetralogy, Runaway Horses, which also has reference to this incident in 1936 when these young officers attempted an overthrow which was designed to restore the power of the nation into the hands of the emperor. It's the same idea. It's the idea that terrorism is a way to create access to the warrior's death, which is a way of creating access to a sense of being alive. What happens is that in that final moment, when the assassin does in fact kill someone, and then as he begins to die, the sunset kind of comes out and registers behind his fluttering, dying eyelids. This is once again a recapitulation of that paradox about, first of all, terrorism as the access to painful death as a warrior in a time of peace, which paradoxically creates, as it occurs, the sense of vital aliveness. Mishima's Shield Society, which was his small army of young men dedicated to defending or shielding the emperor, took place in the last couple of years of his life when his ultranationalism, real or unreal, simulated or partially simulated, whatever it was really developing apace.
In a way, the growth of the Army of the Shield, the Tatenokai, was something which grew out of his beliefs and out of the necessities of the image that he was very anxious to project. It came from his interest in the martial arts. He was very good at kendo, which is Japanese sword fighting, And I think most of his soldiers, most of the boys in the army, came from sports connections of one kind or another.
They were mostly rural guys, as I remember, looking for something to identify with. And after all, he was a very famous and charismatic and interesting fellow. So all of a sudden they found themselves in this league of brothers. There was a blood oath. They got these fancy costumes. He was able to parade them, on the rooftops of the National Theater. Really is sort of mind-blowing how this happened.
People have said that there's some sort of connection between what the Tatenokai were taught and thought and then traditional samurai ideals. Well, Mishima thought there was a great connection. He wrote a whole book, Sun and Steel, about this. The idea of the duty of the samurai is to die. He took the wartime idea of Bushido and burnished it to fit his own needs. He believed very strongly that there was a strong connection between his Tatenokai boys and real samurai. Whether the boys themselves believed this, I don't know, but they believed everything else, so they might as well believe this as well, I suppose.
The apparently abrupt and unprecedented development in Mishima of what we might call some kind of political consciousness or emphasis, which takes place actually in about the mid-60s, is one of the things that led me, of course, and has led others to conclude that this apparently political ending was some kind of ruse, and that in fact, explaining it would require looking deeply into his own personal motivation. Because it is true that as certainly as recently in his own life, as 1960 or so, he's writing very aggressively and assertively saying, I don't care about politics, I don't care what happens to the government, it's just not my thing. I'm an aesthete, I'm more interested in the sunset than I am in anything else.
Of course, some people ask, well, why did he even kill himself at all? There are a number of factors that tell something about him. One, of course, is the method, which was very rightist indeed. It's so rightist that nobody killed themselves that way ever since probably the end of the war, as far as I know. To do something that traditional was very shocking in modern Japan. People were truly shocked by, not so much that he did it, he talked about it often enough that came as no surprise, but the way in which he did it. Also, Mishima was a rather vain person, and he was very proud of his body. And at that age, how old was he? 40, going on 45. He was watching the gradual dissimulation of the body, and he simply couldn't stand it. He thought that there is nothing uglier in the world than old people. He said this very often. And so he didn't want to become an old person. He had said he was written out after he finished his great tetralogy. He said to me, what am I going to write next? What am I going to write next? And I said, write a comedy. You haven't written one of those. No, I'm serious. He really felt that he was sort of written out. That would be another reason for killing oneself. You have to weigh all of this together. It is very ironic because he killed himself for these ideals. He also killed himself in order to fully impress his lesson. But in so doing, he created a taboo which alienated practically all of his followers.
The public itself, in general, was not sympathetic because they felt the same way. What is this man doing to us? Now everybody's going to think that we're the way we were in Pearl Harbor or something, the kamikaze pilots or whatever. All of these negative associations are going to be triggered by this act. And so, except for pockets on the right, it seems to me that the national reaction to what happened was one of antipathy, anger, even dismay.
Since his death, some critics have begun to doubt his sincerity. That is, they would say that it wasn't that he really wanted to establish what it looked like he wanted. Hooray for the emperor, and then back to the wartime ethic and Bushido for everybody. But what he really wanted out of this was something else, that he really wanted a big final scene. He had determined that he was going to kill himself, but he wanted to have a plausible reason for doing this. he created a great mystery as to why he did it, when he did it, what, who, what's this, which still reverberates down the corridors of history now, which is, nearly half a century after it happened. I remember the last time I saw Mishima was about maybe a month, 2 or 3 weeks before he died. He invited me out, and we went to one of his favorite restaurants, and always with him, it was a Western restaurant, went to a place called the Crescent, and had, sort of French food. And he wouldn't talk about anything except a certain samurai who was very famous in Japan, called Saigo Takamori, who was also on the side of the emperor, and who eventually killed himself and had his head chopped off by his beloved friend. He wouldn't talk about him at all and kept repeating, as though he were trying to teach me lines or something, this was the last samurai, this was the last samurai. So I took it all in, and then I got news that he'd killed himself a month later, and what came out of my mouth? It wasn't Saigo Takamori, it was Mishima, who was the last samurai. I played my part.